The silk curtains trembled in the forbidden eastern wing of the Forbidden City, though no wind had been permitted to enter these chambers for 300 years. Behind those blood-red drapes, beneath a ceiling painted with 10,000 dragons locked in eternal combat, Empress Wu Menyang performed ceremonies that would later be described in hushed whispers as acts so profane that even writing their names could summon demons from the netherworld itself. It was the autumn of 690 CE, and something ancient had awakened in the heart of the Tang dynasty. If you're captivated by the darkest secrets history tried to bury, make sure to follow this channel. What you're about to hear has been suppressed for over a millennium. But today, we resurrect the truth. To understand the rituals, you must first understand the woman. Wu Zetian, the only woman to ever rule China as emperor in her own right, did not simply ascend to power. She clawed her way up through a palace system designed to destroy ambitious women, leaving behind a trail of corpses, broken families, and whispered accusations of witchcraft that would echo through Chinese history for the next 1,000 years. Born in 624 CE to a wealthy timber merchant, Wu Menyang entered the imperial palace at 14 as a low-ranking concubine to Emperor Taizong. She was beautiful, yes, but beauty alone was a commodity as common as rice in the Forbidden City. What set Wu apart was her mind, sharp as an executioner's blade and twice as merciless. She learned to read and write when most women were forbidden even these basic skills. She studied military strategy, Confucian philosophy, and most dangerously of all, she learned the secret languages of power that pulsed through the palace like blood through veins. When Emperor Taizong died in 649 CE, Wu should have been sent to a Buddhist monastery to live out her days in celibate contemplation, as was the fate of all imperial concubines. But Wu had already seduced the heir, Prince Li Ji, in an act considered tantamount to incest under Confucian law. Within 2 years, she had returned to the palace as the concubine of the new emperor. Within 5 years, she had engineered the downfall of Empress Wang and consort Xiao, both of whom were accused of witchcraft, stripped of their titles, and, according to sources that still make historians uncomfortable, had their hands and feet severed before being thrown into wine vats to die slowly, their screams echoing through the palace halls. Wu took the title of Empress in 655 CE, but titles were never enough for her. The palace historians, those brave or foolish enough to record the truth, wrote that after ascending to Empress, Wu began to change. She spent hours alone in chambers forbidden even to her husband. She consulted with Taoist priests and Buddhist monks simultaneously, seeking knowledge that violated the boundaries between the spiritual traditions. She collected ancient texts, some written on human skin, others bound in covers of unknown origin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And she became obsessed with sex, not as pleasure, but as ritual, as power, as communion with forces that predated the dynasties, the empire, perhaps even the gods themselves. The eastern wing of the palace had been sealed since the reign of Emperor Yang of Sui, over 60 years before Wu's birth. The official records stated it had been condemned due to structural instability. The unofficial whispers spoke of murders, suicides, and one particularly disturbing incident involving the emperor's youngest daughter and a mirror that showed not reflections, but prophecies. Prophecies that drove her to claw out her own eyes. Wu ordered it reopened in the winter of 675 CE. The workers who broke the seals reported a smell that made several of them vomit, not decay, but something sweeter and far more unsettling, like flowers blooming in a corpse. The chambers beyond had been preserved perfectly by the dry air, untouched by time. Furniture remained where it had been abandoned decades ago. Silk robes still hung on wooden frames. And in the central chamber, on a platform of black jade, sat a bed carved from a single piece of sandalwood, inlaid with symbols that none of the court scholars could identify. Wu claimed this space as her private meditation chamber. No servants were permitted to enter. No guards were posted at its doors. Even her husband, the emperor, now weakened by illness and increasingly dependent on Wu's counsel, was forbidden from crossing its threshold. What happened inside became known only through fragments. The testimony of servants who claimed to hear chanting in languages that predated Chinese itself, the reports of palace eunuchs who swore they saw shadows moving beneath the door despite no light burning within, and the confessions, extracted under torture, of participants who would later be executed and their families erased from history. The rituals began simply enough. Wu would select men from the palace, guards, officials, occasionally princes or visiting dignitaries. The criteria for selection seemed arbitrary to outside observers. Some were young and beautiful, others were elderly and scarred. Some were renowned warriors, others were scholars who had never held a weapon. The only commonality was that each man would receive a summons written in red ink on black paper, sealed with Wu's personal chop. Those who received the summons had no choice but to obey. To refuse was to invite execution, disgrace, and the annihilation of one's entire lineage. In 678 CE, a mid-level palace official named Lu Ming received the summons. What makes his account valuable is that he survived, though whether survival was mercy or curse remains debatable, and before his eventual execution, he wrote a secret testimony that was smuggled out of the palace by his younger brother, preserved in a Buddhist monastery, and only rediscovered in the 1930s by archaeologists excavating a collapsed temple in Shanxi province. His account, written in trembling characters that grew increasingly erratic across the pages, described what happened in the Chamber of 10,000 Flowers. I arrived at the hour of the rat, as commanded. The doors opened without hand or voice, as if the chamber itself had been waiting. Inside, the air was thick with incense, not sandalwood or jasmine, but something that made my throat tighten and my vision blur at the edges. The Empress stood at the center of the room, wearing robes of pure white, her hair unbound and falling to her waist. She was 54 years old at this time, but in that light, or perhaps because of whatever I had breathed, she appeared ageless. Not young, but beyond time entirely. She spoke to me in a voice that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. She said, "You have been chosen not for who you are, but for what flows through you. Tonight you are not a man. You are a vessel. You are a gate. You are a bridge between the world of solid things and the world of hungers." She instructed me to disrobe and lie upon the bed of black jade. The moment my skin touched the stone, I felt electricity course through my body, not painful but terrifying in its intensity, as if I had become a lightning rod for forces I could neither see nor comprehend. The Empress disrobed. What followed was not lovemaking as I had ever known it. There was no tenderness, no passion in the human sense. It was methodical, ritualistic. She moved according to patterns, positions that corresponded to markings on the floor I had not noticed before, symbols that glowed faintly in the darkness. She spoke continuously in that multi-directional voice, reciting verses I did not understand, but which made my bones vibrate in their sockets. And then the shadows came. I do not know how else to describe them. They were not cast by light. They moved independently, flowing across the walls like ink in water. They seemed drawn to our coupling, gathering closer, pressing against some invisible barrier. The temperature in the room dropped until I could see my breath, despite the sweat covering my body. The Empress's eyes had rolled back in her head. She was no longer seeing this world, I am certain of it. She was looking somewhere else, somewhere terrible. And whatever looked back was trying to use our joining as a doorway. I do not remember when it ended. I woke in my own quarters 3 days later with no memory of leaving the chamber. My body bore marks, not bruises or scratches, but symbols burned into my skin as if by frozen fire. They faded within weeks, but sometimes, in certain lights, I can still see them glowing faintly beneath the surface. I was never the same. Food tastes like ash. Sleep brings only nightmares of vast geometries and entities so immense that galaxies are but cells in their bodies. I hear whispers in empty rooms. And sometimes I feel her still, as if part of what happened in that chamber bound me to the Empress in ways that transcend flesh and loyalty. I write this as warning and confession both. What the Empress summons cannot be controlled. She believes she is harnessing power, but I know, that she has merely opened a door, and what waits on the other side has been patient for aeons. It can wait a little longer, feeding on what she offers, growing stronger with each ritual. When it finally comes through, may the Buddha have mercy on us all. Lu Ming was executed 6 months after writing this testimony, accused of embezzlement and corruption. His family was scattered. His name was struck from official records, but his words survived, hidden in a clay jar sealed with wax, buried beneath temple stones. And he was not the only one who left testimony. For nearly 15 years, Wu Zetian conducted her rituals in secrecy. She grew more powerful with each ceremony, or so it seemed to those who observed her. In 683 CE, when her husband Emperor Gaozong died, potentially poisoned, though this was never proven, Wu seized control as Empress Dowager. Ruling through puppet emperors she installed and deposed at will. In 690 CE, she took the final step that no woman had ever dared. She proclaimed herself Emperor of China, establishing the Zhou dynasty and taking the reign name Zetian, ruler of heaven. But absolute power breeds absolute paranoia, and Wu's rituals, no matter how secret, could not remain hidden forever. The scandal broke in 693 CE when a palace maid, driven mad by what she had witnessed through cracks in the chamber walls, ran through the palace streets screaming about demons and shadows and the Empress coupling with darkness itself. She was immediately apprehended, but not before her words spread like plague through the marketplace. The Confucian officials, who had long despised Wu for her usurpation of male authority, saw their opportunity. Led by Chancellor Di Renji, one of the few officials brave enough to challenge the Empress, they compiled testimonies from servants, guards, and participants. The accusations were explosive, not just sexual impropriety, but sorcery, demon worship, and the corruption of cosmic order itself. Wu's response was characteristically brutal. She launched a campaign of terror that made her previous purges seem merciful by comparison. Thousands were arrested on charges of treason and slander. The torture chambers beneath the Forbidden City ran red with blood. Entire families were eradicated. Officials who had served her faithfully for decades were torn apart by horses in public executions designed to maximize suffering and spectacle. But she could not kill the rumors. They spread beyond the palace, beyond the capital, into the provinces and the countryside. Buddhist monasteries denounced her as a demon in human flesh. Taoist temples performed exorcisms in her name without permission. Peasants reported signs and omens, rivers running backward, birds falling dead from the sky, children born speaking in unknown tongues. The empire itself seemed to be rejecting her. In the spring of 705 CE, at the age of 81, Wu Zetian was forced to abdicate. Her son Zhongzong was restored to the throne, and Wu was given the title of Empress Dowager once more, a humiliating demotion for a woman who had ruled as emperor for 15 years. She retreated to the eastern wing, to the Chamber of 10,000 Flowers. What happened in her final months is largely unknown. She refused visitors. She took no meals. The servants who left food outside her door reported that it remained untouched. Yet the Empress clearly did not starve. Some claimed to hear 2 voices coming from the chamber, Wu's and another deeper, that spoke in rhythms like earthquake and avalanche. On December 16, 705 CE, Wu Zetian died. The official cause was old age and natural decline. But the servants who prepared her body for burial told a different story. They found her in the chamber, lying on the bed of black jade, wearing robes of pure white now yellowed with age. Her expression was one of triumph, not death. And her body, according to these witnesses, who were later silenced, bore no signs of decay whatsoever. Her skin remained supple. Her hair had regained its black color. She looked as she had in her prime, 50 years younger than her actual age. Most disturbing of all were her eyes. They had been open when she died, but they did not stare blankly into nothing as corpses' eyes do. They tracked movement, following the servants as they moved around the room. One servant, a woman named Chen who had served Wu for 30 years, later claimed that as she leaned over the body, Wu's lips moved, and a voice, not Wu's, but the other voice that had been heard in her final months, whispered, "The door remains open. The bridge has been built. Thank you for your service." The body was sealed in a jade coffin so heavy it required 40 men to lift. It was buried in the Qianling Mausoleum alongside Emperor Gaozong, though in death Wu was denied the title she had claimed in life. Her tomb was not marked with the title Emperor, but merely Empress Consort. The Chamber of 10,000 Flowers was sealed immediately after her death. The seals were not ordinary. They bore symbols from Buddhist, Taoist, and older traditions, all layered together in a desperate attempt to contain whatever might remain inside. The entire eastern wing was condemned once more, this time permanently. But seals can be broken. In the centuries following Wu Zetian's death, the Chamber of 10,000 Flowers became legendary, a cautionary tale told to ambitious women, a horror story whispered in palace corridors, and a mystery that obsessed historians and occultists alike. Several attempts were made to reopen the chamber over the dynasties. Each ended in disaster. In 843 CE, during the Tang dynasty's twilight years, a Taoist priest convinced Emperor Wuzong to break the seals, claiming he could purify whatever evil remained. The priest entered alone. His screams were heard for 3 days before falling silent. When guards finally entered, they found him curled in a corner, his hair turned completely white, his eyes vacant. He never spoke another coherent word, though he lived another 40 years in an asylum, occasionally writing symbols on walls that made visitors physically ill to look upon. In 1127 CE, during the chaos of the Jin invasion, looters broke into the eastern wing seeking treasure. 15 men entered. 3 returned, babbling about shadows with too many angles and voices that sang in frequencies that caused bleeding from the ears. The chamber was sealed again. In 1644 CE, as the Ming dynasty collapsed and the Qing dynasty rose, a scholar named Wang Fuji sought to investigate the historical truth behind the Wu Zetian legends. He gained access to the eastern wing and spent a single night in the Chamber of 10,000 Flowers. His notes, discovered later, consisted mostly of mathematical equations attempting to describe spatial geometries that should not exist in 3-dimensional space, interspersed with frantic pleas to make the angles stop breeding. The chamber was sealed for the final time in 1776 CE during the reign of the Qianlong Emperor. The seals this time were not merely symbolic. The entire wing was filled with concrete, encasing the chamber and everything within in a solid mass designed to last millennia. It remains sealed to this day. So what was Wu Zetian truly doing in the Chamber of 10,000 Flowers? Was it merely sexual ritual, scandalous but ultimately human? Was it a cult practice, an attempt to commune with forces beyond mortal understanding? Or was it something far more disturbing, a successful summoning? A genuine contact with entities that exist outside our normal perception of reality? The rational explanation is that Wu Zetian, brilliant and ruthless, used sexuality and spiritual theater to consolidate power and maintain psychological control over her supporters and enemies alike. The rituals were political tools, designed to create an aura of divine authority and supernatural legitimacy for a woman ruling in defiance of every social norm. But the testimonies remain: the strange deaths, the unexplained phenomena, the chamber that even now, 1,300 years after Wu's death, remains sealed with concrete and multiple layers of spiritual protection. And there are the dreams. Modern construction workers who have worked on restoration projects near the Eastern Wing report recurring nightmares. Tourists who visit the Forbidden City sometimes photograph strange anomalies near the sealed chambers. Shadows that move independently, patterns of light that seem to pulse with rhythmic intention. Security guards avoid that section of the complex after sunset. Perhaps most disturbingly, several Chinese historians who have devoted their careers to studying Wu Zetian have reported similar experiences, a sense of being watched, whispers in empty rooms, and the recurring dream of a woman in white robes standing in a chamber lit by no visible source, extending her hand in invitation and saying, in a voice that speaks directly to the mind rather than the ears, "The door remains open. Come and see what I have built." Most dismiss these accounts as suggestion and superstition, the psychological echoes of a dark legend. But a few scholars, historians, and mystics who have studied the original testimonies, who have traced the symbols described in Lu Ming's confession, who have mapped the geometry of the rituals Wu performed, believe something different. They believe Wu Zetian was attempting to bridge the gap between human consciousness and something vast and hungry that exists in dimensions adjacent to our own. They believe she succeeded, at least partially, and they believe that the door she opened has never truly closed, that it waits in the darkness beneath layers of concrete and spiritual seals, still accessible to those who know the correct rituals, the proper symbols, the right offerings. After all, Wu Zetian's final words, according to those who witnessed her death, were not a confession or a prayer. They were an instruction manual, encoded in verse, describing the exact procedures needed to complete what she had begun. Those verses were ordered destroyed immediately. But in a palace of 10,000 rooms and 10,000 secrets, how certain can we be that every copy was found? On quiet nights in Beijing, when the air is thick with humidity and the ancient stones of the Forbidden City hold the heat of the day, security guards sometimes report hearing sounds from the eastern wing. Not footsteps or voices, nothing so simple. Instead, they describe a rhythmic pulsing, like breathing, or like a heartbeat, emanating from beneath the ground where the chamber of 10,000 flowers lies entombed. The official explanation is settling concrete, thermal expansion, acoustic tricks played by wind moving through sealed spaces. But the guards who have worked there for decades, who have felt the subtle wrongness that permeates that section of the palace, know better. They recognize that rhythm. They've heard it in their dreams. It's the cadence of Wu Zetian's rituals, still being performed in spaces beyond human perception, by practitioners who may no longer be entirely human, for purposes that were never meant for mortal understanding. The Empress wanted to become immortal, to transcend the limitations of flesh and gender and dynasty. Perhaps in a way that would horrify even her, she succeeded. Not by conquering death, but by becoming something else entirely. Something that waits, something that feeds, something that, after 13 centuries of patience, has learned that time means nothing when you've etched yourself into the foundation of reality itself. The door remains open, the bridge still stands, and somewhere in the darkness beneath Beijing, in a chamber filled with concrete that should have silenced everything, the rituals continue. Wu Zetian promised she would rule forever. Be careful what you wish for, especially if you're willing to pay the price in flesh, in blood, in souls, and in the tearing apart of the fabric that separates our warm, safe world from the cold infinities beyond. The Empress wanted to shock the empire. Instead, she may have poisoned reality itself, and the poison spreads slowly, patiently, eternally, just as she planned.